Hi, and welcome back to the Contemporary Old West channel with BF Biles. If you enjoy westerns, I hope you'll give my channel a shot and hit that subscribe button. If you're interested in a signed copy of my novel Hunting Charm, you can check out my Patreon page or email me directly. I'd also invite you to check out my author's page on Amazon. Links below. In today's episode, you'll hear the first half of Chapter 8 of my novel, Hunting Charm. If you haven't listened to the previous chapters, I recommend you do so. I have the first 7 chapters in a playlist, and it's probably best you start with Chapter 1. In today's Plate of History Beans, we'll look briefly at the part of Oklahoma that was commonly called Indian Territory, as opposed to another section of what is now Oklahoma that was sometimes referred to as Oklahoma Territory. So here's part 1 of Chapter 8 of Hunting Charm, The Slap. Chapter 8, Hunting Charm, The Slap. The journey in the back of Mr. Sugar's wagon grew increasingly stressful. The flatlands of Kansas gave way to forested areas of oak, pecan, and elm, or marshy lowlands where mosquitoes and flies swarmed around her face and legs. The change from the flatlands of Kansas gave her the impression they had traveled a great distance from her home in Abilene. The predominantly white populace she was familiar with gave way to native and colored folks who gazed at her suspiciously or with outright hostility. They passed one sizable town, a place Mr. Sugars called Tulsi. Then, beyond that, the road grew more primitive. Framed houses grew scarce, replaced by circular adobe huts or wattle and daub structures where native folks sat weaving baskets, cleaning hides, or simply watching as they rolled by. She wondered if any towns like Abilene existed in this part of the world. It hadn't occurred to her when she left home she would find herself in a place so different from anything she had previously known. Sleep became nearly impossible. Her valise and the bolt of calico fabric, while charming at first, were hardly as accommodating as her feather bed. She decided to try the ground one evening, thinking she might find a bit of lush grass to recline upon. Unfortunately, finding such a spot proved impossible, and she was soon back in the wagon, tossing about, trying to find a comfortable position upon the lumber and other supplies. Meanwhile, the men had a tent and canvas army cots, and based upon their snores, slept soundly. She thought about asking for one of the cots, but couldn't summon the courage to make such a demand. The 2 men never spoke, except to each other. She felt annoyed they acted as if she didn't exist. It didn't occur to her that based upon her threats, they might fear her. Early on the 8th day, she lost all patience and spoke to Mr. Sugars. "How much further is it? You should be more personable and talk with me." "Yes, ma'am, I reckon I could." Mr. Sugars spoke in a low voice, both resonant and pleasant. "Though I ain't too sure what I might say." "I asked you a question, didn't I?" "Yes, ma'am, we is getting right close to home. We're probably gonna camp up here one more night, then get in tomorrow." "Is it nice there?" "Well, now, I don't know what you are accustomed to, but for myself, Mr. Cecil's place is right nice. We got plenty to eat and a warm roof and a clean, dry bed. Ain't no fine things like china dishes and such, but we are decent, hard-working folks." She thought about keeping the conversation going, but realized Mr. Sugars was right. They had little to say to one another. "Where is the nearest town?" Doreen imagined she might set out on foot, anything to relieve the tedium. "Miss, ain't no towns of any size in these parts. Now, we got plenty of folks out here, but most of them are what y'all might call Indians. Now, over 2 days' ride or so, there's a fella who owns a little store, though he ain't got much compared to the store y'all got over there in Abilene. Is there somewhere I can get a hotel room and send a telegram? This here is Indian territory, missus. They got a telegraph over at Fort Gibson. I reckon you could go on over there, but there ain't much but Indian folks living between here and there. Ain't no white folks hardly at all, even at the fort. Only soldiers, maybe 50 men. Since the war, they just using Dixon for supplies, things the government gives to the native folks. How long would it take to walk there? What? Mr. Sugars seemed shocked at the idea. No, ma'am, you can't walk over there. Shoot, it could take you 3 or 4 days to get over there on a mule. What we're going to do is get back to Mr. Cecil's place. Then you and I will go on over to Fort Gibson, send word to your people. I'm not going. I may walk on my own, but I'm not going with you. Mr. Sugar started to reply, but thought better of it. So once more they sat in silence. That night they traveled late, switching out mule teams twice. The next morning they left early. Won't be much longer now, missus. An hour later the old man pointed to a handful of buildings in the distance. They'll be home, he said. Cecil hadn't spoken to Doreen in 3 days. His gut instinct and experience with his white commanding officers had taught him that silence was usually the best course. Even though he felt such anxiety regarding Doreen's presence that when they arrived, he hardly noticed the affectionate hugs from his children or his wife's preparations for their much-anticipated return. Cynthia had managed to get a tin of chocolate and had prepared a cake. She knew the money from the sale of their stock would make things easier. Instead of the joyous occasion she had imagined, however, Cynthia Johnson found herself looking at Doreen Tarwater and her husband silently unloading the wagons. Doreen, confronted by the modest Johnson ranch, nearly burst into tears. The house, a structure built mostly of sod and logs, looked barely large enough to house 2 people, much less the 5 that lived there. 50 yards away stood a decent-sized barn alongside a shabby post and rail corral housing a pair of rangy-looking milk cows. The property, clean and well-kept, was nevertheless well beneath Doreen's standards. She wondered about where she might stay. After all, she couldn't be expected to sleep in a room with a family of colored folks. Unfortunately, the house seemed to be the only structure built for human habitation. Would she sleep outdoors? Perhaps, she thought briefly, the family could move out and give her use of the house. Part of her had been hoping that Cecil Johnson was lying about his status as the owner of his own place. The notion they would eventually arrive at a large, comfortable ranch owned by white folks had, to some extent, kept her in decent spirits. Now faced with the reality of the Johnsons' ranch, she reflected once more upon her own home, her bedroom with 2 wardrobes filled with gowns, her dressing table with silver filigreed brushes, her carved jewelry box with a ballerina that popped up and played a tinkling melody. "Where might I be sleeping?" she asked. A moment of silence passed as Cecil looked first at his wife, then at Doreen. Cecil had already considered the question. His options were limited. "I reckon you can sleep there in the shed," Cecil replied. "Mr. Sugars has him a room fixed up right nice in there. We spoke of it already. He'll stay with friends for a bit. It ain't fancy, but it keeps the rain off, and it's got a wood floor." "You mean I'm going to sleep in the barn?" Doreen asked. "Yes, ma'am, unless you want to sleep in the house. Of course, we have 3 children, and it's crowded. You can see in the wagon I bought some lumber for a new room, but that's likely to take a few weeks. Still, though, if the barn ain't suitable, we could put you in the house, if that sounds better." "Where will Mr. Sugar sleep? He couldn't possibly sleep in there with me." "No, ma'am, of course not. As I said, Mr. Sugars will ride over and stay with some folks nearby. I don't reckon you'll be planning to stay with us long." "Well, Doreen paused. She had entertained thoughts of Fort Worth or Galveston, but now, in this strange new land, those destinations felt less attainable. An overwhelming sense of helplessness seized her. I'm not sure how long I'll stay. I suppose you're right. No more than a few days." Cecil could see the change in Doreen. Her lower lip quivered and she glanced around nervously. He realized that despite her bravado, she must be scared, possibly for the first time in her life. The realization brought him no comfort. From his days in the army, Cecil understood that fear can make men behave unpredictably. "Ma'am, you ain't got nothing to fear." Cecil spoke in his kindest tone. "We'll make certain you get all you need to eat. You're safe here. Ain't no harm going to come to you." I am very tired." "Yes, ma'am." "Perhaps you could show me where I'm sleeping?" Cecil turned to his wife. "Cynthia, would you show Miss Tarwater to the bunkhouse? She'll be bedding down in Mr. Sugar's place for a few days." On today's Plate of History Beans, I hope to serve up a brief overview of the parts of America that were occupied by native cultures starting at the beginning of the 19th century through the 1870s. If you're interested in this topic, I'll include a few links below. Between the years of 1790 and 1834, the U.S. government passed a series of laws that designated certain areas of the United States as Indian country. Towards the end of the 18th century, what was called Indian country covered an enormous swath of land, much of it acquired in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. Indian country covered land that stretched from present-day Oklahoma in the south into Kansas, parts of Colorado, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. The 6 main statutes that set boundaries upon Indian country were compiled to form what is commonly called the Indian Non-Intercourse Act of 1834. I'll include a link below that has more information about the Indian Non-Intercourse Act. It's 17 pages of archaic legalese, but it's not a bad read if you're interested in the disposition of Indian versus U.S. lands in the 19th century. Until the mid-19th century, many First Nations tribes lived in the region called Indian country and had little contact with white Americans. There were numerous instances of raids and atrocities on both sides, but for the most part, the ancient cultures existed as they had for hundreds of years. A major turning point among many other lesser ones came in 1830, when President Andrew Jackson formulated the Indian Removal Act of 1830. I won't dwell on the myriad of ways that the law was implemented, except to say, under the Indian Removal Act, things changed greatly for many tribal cultures and Indian country was quickly whittled down to what we now call Indian Territory, which encompassed most of what is now Oklahoma. I'm going to post a Wikipedia link below. I recommend the page on Indian Territory if you're concerned about accuracy or citing information. Don't forget that Wikipedia includes references with links at the bottom of each listing. The reference section on Wikipedia's Indian Territory page will provide you hours of reading if you're so inclined. Since much of the action in Hunting Charm takes place in Creek or Muscogee territory in the 1870s, here's a map I found especially useful in my research. It's from 1902, but gives a detailed look at the terrain. I've also traveled through that part of Oklahoma several times. If you're interested in native culture, I highly recommend spending a few days in central Oklahoma visiting places like Okmulgee, Muscogee, Okemah, Wetumpka, Chakotah, Eufaula, and Bristow. Almost any small town you visit in that neck of the woods has a museum or monument with fascinating stuff related directly to the Muscogee culture. Nowadays, the Creek Nation is still in place, and their tribal infrastructure is located in roughly the same place it was during the 1870s. Of course, things have changed greatly since that time, but the Muscogee culture remains strong. Again, if you're interested in more about Indian country, Indian Territory, or Muscogee Territory, I recommend you start with the Wikipedia page and scroll down to the references. If you want, take a look at the links I've posted. I'm including a travel guide to the Muscogee Nation. If you're up for 2 or 3 days of immersion in the Muscogee culture, take a look at that. That's it for today's chapter and plate of history beans. I'll be back next week with another chapter from Hunting Charm. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope you'll take a moment to like and subscribe to my channel. See you next time on the Contemporary Old West channel with B.F. Biles.